Good afternoon, everybody. Just to check on the logistics, we will have another lecture this afternoon. After the lecture, we will have again a workshop. And we will do the wrap-up in the same room where we did the workshop. And after the wrap-up, we will have a break. That will be around 3:15, 3:30. Okay? So, as the first three jewels, reincarnation, karma, and hierarchies, provide answers to a lot of questions, they also give rise to new ones. If the same principles govern all life, why is there such diversity? How and why does life express itself in so many ways? Now that we can explain why people like Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart are born with an extraordinary talent, but why did Maria Anna Mozart not build up the same set of karmic consequences as her famous brother did? Why does all that diversity in the universe not lead to total chaos? How is all that diversity supposed to coexist? What is growth? Why do we grow? What then is the purpose and meaning of life? These are persistent questions that mankind has pondered upon throughout the ages. In the introductory lecture of today, you've already heard that there are 7 keys of wisdom that can help us solve all questions and problems we encounter in life. Let's see how the next 2 jewels can help us find an answer to these questions: Swabhāva and progressive evolution. But let's start by going back to what we've learned so far about what man really is. So, in the first lecture, we stated that man, like all life, is a stream of consciousness, flowing from universal, boundless unity. That is what we call the spiritual point of view, or the spiritual principle. The word man is derived from the Sanskrit word manas, which means thinker. If we expand on the composite nature of all living beings that was presented before, we can get an even better understanding of what man really is. So what we see here is, we've already seen this very shortly, Hank presented this to us, is the 7 principles that together compose what man is. So from the top down, there's Atman, the essential pure self, pure consciousness per se, the highest element in our constitution that connects us to all living beings. Secondly, there's Buddhi, the faculty or spiritual organ in man that manifests itself as intuition, understanding, judgment, discrimination. Thirdly, there's Manas, where we derive the word man from, the center of ego consciousness in man, thinking. Kama, the seat of desires, aspirations, and the elemental driving force in the human constitution. As every one of these 7 principles, it is itself septenary. So there's a very spiritual kama as well as a very physical one and all the intermediate stages in between. Prana. Prana can best be understood as the electrical field that manifests itself as vitality. If someone cannot stop moving, even during his sleep, this is vitality at work. I can hear there's some examples in the room here. The Linga Sharira, this is the astral model body, only slightly more ethereal than the physical body. It's the framework around which the human body is built. The physical body is built. This principle explains why amputees often still experience the presence of a lost limb, as in an itching toe on a foot that is no longer there. And the Stula Sharira, the physical material body, Strictly speaking, it's not a principle, but the carrier of all the inner constitution, the elements we just mentioned. Now, if consciousness is what we essentially are, then what characterizes us is the type of consciousness we are presently learning to express. In the hierarchy of life, man is learning to express manas, thinking. Where animals follow their instincts, man has the ability to self-reflect and make conscious choices. Like every principle, our thinking is also sevenfold. So physical thoughts would be, for instance, hunger, thirst, breathing. The emotional aspect, anger, fear, joy, vitality, anything that has to do with action. You know, sometimes you have this feeling, I have to do something. Desires, this is a neutral force actually in our thinking. It can be aimed at the higher aspirations to serve mankind, like Mother Teresa, or the lower ones, conquer the world, like Genghis Khan, and all modern varieties of Genghis Khan. Manas can be split in a lower one, our usual daily thoughts. I should not forget to take the laundry out of the dryer. And the higher ones, the unselfish or intellectual thoughts. How could we win green energy from seawater? Buddhi, the intuitive thoughts, seeing and finding how things are related to one another. And we can find a really nice example of how Buddhi and Manas work together in the work of Einstein. At the age of 16, he finds himself at a new school in the Swiss city of Aarau, where for the first time in his life, teachers are stimulating him to think for himself, to use his imagination, and to develop conceptual thinking. One day he imagines himself running alongside a beam of light. Intuitively, so on a Buddhic level, he already knows then that the wave of emotion would have to be totally independent of time. It still takes 10 years though until he can fully explain what he already knows and shock the world by publishing his theory of relativity. His Buddhic capacities already grasped the idea, but he still needed 10 years to develop the logical capacities, especially mathematics and physics, before he could explain and prove what he already knew. It's harder to find examples for the highest aspect of our thinking, simply because in our present state of development, they occur only very rarely. The best way to describe them is perhaps as moments of pure inspiration, when a beautiful vision emerges, or in experiencing a unity that we might have when we are surrounded by and one with nature. In the course of this lifetime of planet Earth, which in itself is a living being, of which we are a living building block, also undergoing the law of cycles or re-embodiment, we are learning to express and master all these 7 aspects of thinking. If you pick up a newspaper or just look around you in society, you can see what it is that we are predominantly expressing nowadays. So, if the same principles govern all life, why is there such diversity? The 4th jewel can help us to answer that question, Swabhãva. Swabhãva is a word that comes from Sanskrit, and we can derive it as swa meaning self and bhu to become. Together, self-becoming. This 4th jewel essentially tells us that we are what we express from our own core outwards. We and each and every other living being expresses itself, not anybody or anything else. We can clearly observe this in the world around us. An apple seed always grows into an apple tree. No two trees, no 2 trees, that's a nice one, of the same family are exactly the same. And no 2 leaves on any tree are the same. As the Bhagavad Gita says, all beings, even the wise, act according to their own nature. A child being born is a human consciousness having found parents with characteristics to which it finds itself attracted. So there will be similarities with the parents, but it will never be identical. It expresses itself. The consciousness works together with entities like cells, for instance, that are lower in the hierarchy to form a physical body, which is of course also an expression of the Swabhāva, of itself. This explains why organ transplantations will always evoke a natural rejection from the receiving body, which recognizes the deviant characteristics of the received organ. It also explains why no set of twins is completely identical. Their character is never the same. A child may act like its parents, but it will never become its father or mother. What you are currently expressing is always yourself. Nothing more, nothing less. In your own unique way, following your own unique path. That is why Mozart's sister did become a decent music teacher, but not yet a brilliant composer, and it's also why Mozart's didactic qualities were not so great. You cannot express more than what you've developed so far. Very much like you need to practice in this lifetime or another before you can play a piano properly. You can decide today that you want to run the 100 meters in less than 10 seconds tomorrow, but you need to build up relevant experience before you can actually do it. Swabhāva has two general philosophical meanings. Firstly, we are our own creators. Contrary to the whole nature or nurture debate, Theosophy argues that you are neither the result of the combined influence of parents, environment, or whatever came out of the gene lottery. To the contrary, they are the results of your consciousness, your Swabhāva. You create your own character as well as the environment in which you live. It gives a conclusive solution to riddles such as, how did it come about that a man born poor, losing his mother at birth and soon deserted by his father, afflicted with a painful and humiliating disease, left to wander for 12 years among alien cities and conflicting fates, suspected of crime and insanity, and seeing in his last months the apotheosis of his greatest enemy, how did it come about that this man, after his death, triumphed over Voltaire, revived religion, transformed education, elevated the morals of France, inspired the Romantic movement and the French Revolution, influenced the philosophy of Kant and Schopenhauer, the plays of Schiller, the novels of Goethe, the poems of Wordsworth, Byron, Shelley, the socialism of Marx, the ethics of Tolstoy, and altogether had more effect upon posterity than any other writer or thinker of that 18th century, in which writers were more influential than they had ever been before. We're talking about the great French thinker Rousseau. His genius can obviously not be explained as the result of nurture. Another example, Newton, famous physicist, was the son of a humble farmer and an innkeeper, neither of whom was particularly bright. So nature or genes cannot explain it either. It can be, however, from the principle of Swabhāva, unrolling one's unique character and qualities from the inside out. Now, if you are your own creator, it makes absolutely no sense to blame shortcomings of one's character to parents or the environment. We are solely responsible for who we have become. Having said that, Swabhāva is a very positive and hopeful principle, because it also logically implies that we can become who we aim to be. This is the second meaning of Swabhāva. What we are in our higher nature is what we become. Our higher nature contains all the powers and faculties of the cosmos. And the fact that each being becomes what he is in his own higher nature means that we can learn to express this higher nature. In the core of our being, we are a God. We already have all the noble and divine aspects one can imagine. That potential of ourselves we call the higher self. Swabhāva also means we will become that higher self. So if we find something in our character that does not please us, we have the ability to change it, or better to outgrow it. We can do so by creating for ourselves a loftier ideal, focusing on the higher aspects of our thinking. Our potential for growth is also found inside ourselves, in our own higher aspects. So if, for instance, our sweet tooth sometimes completely overtakes us, or we have an anger issue, we can train our thinking to focus on more universal positive thoughts. We will come back to that later on, as well as in the workshop. Our Swabhāva thus marks both the point of arrival as well as a point of departure. When the Buddha was asked, is there a permanent aspect in man? He remained silent. The reason for his silence was the fact that the answer was yes and no. Yes, because consciousness is permanent, and no, because that consciousness is always changing. Its quality does not remain the same. So how is all that expressed diversity supposed to coexist? All living beings are sparks of the same fire, share the same core, as we've seen in the image before, Atman. Let's see, here we have it again, or the universal unity that binds us all together. But at the same time, we express it all differently. And as evolution progresses, the diversity in the visible as well as in the invisible fabrics of living beings only grows. In other words, it is the unquestioned tendency in the living beings of nature to advance towards individuality and away from the perfect communism of the lowest forms of animal life, and from the simple unism of rocks. From this it may be clear that the society that strives for one standard way of acting and thinking is doomed to fail. An ideal society will be a dynamic one, giving room for all these different Swabhāva that together make up society's Swabhāva, provided that the inhabitants use their Swabhāva for the welfare of the whole. It is why Nelson Mandela's words when accepting the Roosevelt Award in 2002 ring so true. He said, "We have to commit ourselves as a global community to the freedom of every person, group, persuasion, or approach to express itself freely and unfettered within the agreed conventions of civility and respect for the right of others. Our differences are our strengths as a species and as a world communion. The reach of globalization is not in order to render us all alike or subjects to the values and definitions of any single dominant mode. The so-called global village offers us the opportunity to share in the wealth of our diversity while recognizing and celebrating our common humanity." If we, ladies and gentlemen, look at the stars in the sky at night, we cannot help but wonder how everything is alive and always on the move, but in such a seemingly perfect order. As we can observe, unity in diversity is a fact in nature, because these stars do not crash into one another every 5 minutes. Yet we human beings seem to have so much difficulty in actually living in unity, because we fail to see our true nature. As H.P. Blavatsky, the founder of the Theosophical Society, put it, "If theosophy prevailing in the struggle, its all-embracing philosophy, strikes deep root into the minds and hearts of men, if its doctrines of reincarnation and karma, in other words, of hope and responsibility, find a home in the lives of the new generations, then, indeed, will dawn the day of joy and gladness for all who now suffer and are outcast. For real theosophy is altruism, and we cannot repeat it too often. It is brotherly love, mutual help, and unswerving devotion to truth. If once men do but realize that in these alone can true happiness be found, and never in wealth, possessions, or any selfish gratification, then the dark clouds will roll away, and a new humanity will be born on earth. Then the golden age will be there, indeed. Well, nice vision for the future, but we have quite a bit of work to do, right? So acknowledging the essential oneness of all life and really understanding its consequences is very inspiring. It implies it makes absolutely no sense to express anyone else but oneself. It can be very useful to follow an example to a certain extent, but in working towards an ideal society, we had better leave our masks at home and be ourselves, our best selves. As we've seen in the keys 1, 2, 3, what we do and think always has an effect, and we can only express ourselves in close cooperation with other living beings. So if we can create a vision of a society that expresses the equivalence of all living beings and refuse to put ourselves at the center of it, to stop thinking that somehow we have more rights than others and contribute the best we can offer within the abilities of our own character, we can become the cornerstones of a very different kind of society. Well, in order to do that, we have to grow, right? But what is growth? According to Plato, life can be defined as self-motion, the ability to act and react, and that life equals movement or change. So change or growth is what defines life. If Swabhāva means self-becoming from the inside out, growth then is unrolling the boundless potential that is within. We are pretty used to seeing the physical aspect of nature around us unfolding. And let's share an example. It does continue. We could say that the same principle applies to every aspect of our constitution. It rolls out from within. It literally evolves. So here we come to the next jewel. Evolution comes from the Latin word ex volvere, which means to unroll. Now one can of course only unroll something that has first been rolled in. So evolution, rolling out, and involution, rolling in, are two inseparable concepts. With respect to life, one can say involution is to fold your consciousness in a suitable body or material instrument to embody your character in order for you to become what you've made yourself. And evolution is to become what you are in potential, to expand and enlarge your consciousness. We see involution clearly reflected in the first 18 to 21 years of a human life when we rebuild our instruments or bodies and learn to control them again. not only physically, but also emotionally and psychologically. So in the first 7 years, we mainly develop our instincts and motoric control. Then from the age of 7 to 14, more or less, we develop our intellect. And from the age of 14 on, we develop our ideals and our intentions to choose our own path in life, as we can clearly observe in puberty. So, we rebuild our whole composite nature on the outer plane, only then to start having new experiences and learning new lessons, which is evolution, expanding our consciousness. With knowledge comes responsibility, is a well-known expression. Once we know something, it is impossible to go back to not knowing it. We may temporarily neglect what we've learned, but we can never erase it or become innocent again. The same applies to the development of consciousness. All that is learned and developed is never lost. We are what we express. Contrary to some contemporary Hindu and Buddhist teachings, we can never regress to being an animal or a vegetable. Presently, we are learning to express human consciousness. And once we become the masters of expressing every aspect of that, we will, in a distant future, in the next cycle of this planet, become the boy servants of the gods. The evolution of life, we can conclude, is always progressive. And this is the fifth jewel. As pilgrims of eternity, we grow through cause and effect, going through cycles of re-embodiment, expressing ourselves in the appropriate level of the hierarchies in which we live, hierarchies that all affect one another. Progressive evolution gives us the key to the meaning of life, comprising the previous 4 jewels. And it's already here. So what is that meaning of life? Coming back to Plato's definition of life, to be able to act and react of itself, movement or change, and evolution being by definition progressive and self-guided, Swabhãva, following the law of karma, the only answer to the question, what's the meaning of life, can be to grow to relative perfection. Man will and can learn to perfectly express manas and continue on to fully express Buddhi, then learning to become a fully evolved God, etc., etc., etc. Thus, we continuously climb the hierarchy of life. Like is stated in the Bible, therefore you are to be perfect, as your heavenly Father is perfect. Looking back, we have made our journey to mankind by being and learning in the elemental, mineral, vegetable, and animal kingdoms first, having the divine kingdom still in front of us. We are now thinkers learning to think. So that could be the reason that man sometimes behaves like a beast, because man does not yet fully master the full potential of his thinking or manas. Now, once again, keep in mind that it's consciousness that develops, because we already know from the first jewel, reincarnation, that consciousness periodically wraps itself in an appropriate vehicle or a body. This is where the Theosophical view on evolution differs fundamentally from the Darwinistic view. While Darwin's teachings were extremely useful in giving an alternative to reigning creationist view, Darwin's ideas are all about the transformation of the body, rather than the evolution of that what is within, consciousness. The Theosophical view on manifested life is that it is consciousness that is the cause, and the material body that is the effect. To put it in another way, you are consciousness and you have temporarily a body. Life develops itself within the hierarchical structure of nature. So looking horizontally, we see the human realm with its human Swabhāva. And looking vertically, there's also the elemental, mineral, vegetable and divine realms with their corresponding Swabhāva. This fifth jewel, combined with the third jewel, hierarchies, tells us that we can grow by learning from the beings that are ahead of us on the evolutionary path. We can easily recognize this when we find ourselves in the vicinity of a noble, honest man. we then find ourselves even more inclined to be honest than we would normally be. Mahatma Gandhi's non-violent protest against oppression inspired millions to follow in his footsteps, even if that meant risking their own physical well-being. Where we follow in the footsteps of those that have gone before us, similarly others follow in ours, including the lower realms in the hierarchy of life, like the animal realm. That is why that same Mahatma Gandhi said that the greatness of a nation can be judged by the way its animals are treated. If only mankind would realize its responsibility towards its younger brothers and sisters. Once we know, ladies and gentlemen, how to lift the veil of scripture or religious rituals, we often find examples of the 7 keys we are talking about today, like Henk already told us. During one of the holiest rituals of the Islamic Hajj, it is common to run the first 3 rounds around the Kaaba, the holy stone in Mecca. The last 4 rounds must be done completely walking. Only in the last round is one allowed to touch the holy stone. Very much like a child using the first 18 to 21 years of its life to become itself again, this is a symbolic representation of man having lived many lives as man before, and therefore having already developed the first lower 3 aspects in his constitution, but now compelled to slow down to master the next 4, before he finally becomes the divine man he potentially is. So how do we grow? If growing is developing our full potential as human beings, we can use our free will to give direction to our growth. If we look again at the 7 aspects of thinking, we can learn to master, to give direction to our thoughts. We become what we think. And what is our common Western perspective on growth? What do we focus our attention on? Do we focus on material wealth, power, physical strength? Or do we focus more on the higher, universal, and ethical aspects of our thinking? As we leave our lower aspects periodically behind when we die, material or physical growth is temporary and therefore illusionary. Knowing that, the more sustainable choice between bodybuilding and Buddhi-building is easy to make. And of course you have a free will, so you can take your own pick. Does that mean that we should neglect our physical constitution and needs? No, because we need those lower aspects to move and learn. We should, however, learn to master them with our higher aspects, very much like a musician learns to master a violin. He determines the sound it makes, not the instrument. How often do we lose control and succumb to our instincts or emotions? We still have a lot to learn. So Buddhi-building, how does that work? The following ancient adagio from the Upanishads says it all. Sow a thought, harvest an action. Sow an action, harvest a habit. Sow a habit, harvest a character. All actions start with a thought. I will feel hungry before I move to the kitchen to prepare a salad. And a compassionate thought will bring me to help another person. When we repeat an action often enough, we will develop a habit. And if we master our thinking, we can thus consciously develop our habits. If a habit is a part of our system, for long enough it will become a part of our character. And that is what we essentially are, Swabhãva. So we become what we think. How to start? We could start by forming a vision of life. Very much like that ideal society we talked about before. Make that vision as encompassing and as universal as you can possibly imagine, beyond me and beyond my lifetime, based upon the unity of life. Then make it a living philosophy by acting on it with persistent discipline. This will be one of the main subjects of the next lecture. So, what are some of the main thoughts that we've shared together? Manas, thinking, is what man is learning to express. We are our own creators, Swabhāva. We are in our higher nature, what we are in our higher nature is what we will become, also Swabhāva. We are essentially one, and coexistence means cooperation. Progressive evolution. The meaning of life is to develop our full potential. And we can give direction to our growth by learning to master our thinking. Any questions before we go to the workshop? All right, and let me take you to the questions for the workshop quickly first. So a good one to start with is, do you actually recognize that you're already something coming into this life? That we're not tabula rasa or a blank slate coming into this life. That there's already something there. Can we find examples of this at work? That everything starts with a thought, and from thought you develop action, habit, and character. And if so, how can we grow? What are the kind of thoughts that we want to think to become who we want to be? And then to wrap things up, you can of course keep this in the back of your head. What becomes more and what becomes less important? Knowing about these two jewels. Now in terms of time management, because it's nice, I have a responsibility for that as well. And that seems to be a karma consequence of I don't know what. Let's see if we can start the wrap up in 40 minutes. So that's 5 minutes past 3. Is that okay? The tables are again next door, so grab a cup of coffee. Well, you can do the same group, and if you feel that that is not really your universe, then of course you're happy to move, but same groups will be easy. Let's be compassionate.